Saddle up, bone ponies, because you're here with Tabletop Totality. And today's podcast will be brought to you by Neil,
Steven, and Cody.
We will be talking about combat on your role-playing sessions. So your tabletop games, D&D, Call of Cthulhu, maybe you're going out there and just picking up some random stuff. I would personally, say Simbaru. But besides all that,
Nice product placement for Simbaroom.
Dude,
We're not sponsored by
No,
Simbaroom,
we're
but
not
we would
sponsored by-
love to be. Not
yeah,
yet.
not sponsored by any of these. We're just avid fans. But combat is no
Rabid
matter what.
fans.
Yeah, rabid fans. Combat is always going to be a part of these type of games, and it ends up being that part that can kind of, when you're depending on how you're playing it, drag that session down. Everybody wants a big boss killing, or I gotta fight this dragon and here's the big boss, but sometimes those combats can take a while, be draining. Not just for your player character, but for you.
Yeah, and I think too is that some people maybe don't design their character with combat in mind, whereas a lot of people it's the opposite, where they design their character very much with combat in mind. I know for myself, I usually enjoy characters that have a pretty good backstory, that have some sort of, I enjoy the role play aspect more, but I do like to be at least capable in combat. I wouldn't say I build all of my characters to be the best at it, but I do want them to be able to do something. I don't want them to feel helpless. But the point is that combat isn't necessarily everybody's big thing. It's not what everybody is looking for. So we wanted to try to come up with a couple points that we think help move that along, but also make it enjoyable for everybody at the table.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because we do understand that combat isn't always something that needs to happen. And a lot of people, they sit down, they might start their first session ever playing a tabletop RPG, and that's what they believe. Like, combat is a big factor. And sometimes you just gotta, there's points where you can do other actions that keep you from not having to go and slay this group of lizard folk somewhere. You know what I mean? You could do that diplomatic approach, but we will focus in this session on the combat, how to make that more efficient, more enjoyable, and a better experience overall. So I think we'll just dive right into it if you guys are ready for it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, man.
All right. So kind of our first point that we'll talk about is the whole damage description. I think this is a big factor that a lot of people just kind of get too caught up in the numbers of, I just dealt 50 damage, but don't go into the aspect of how that affects the person you're attacking or anything.
Right. And I think that kind of comes down to how you do it at your table.
Yeah.
I've seen it where people think that the hit points is basically how many times your character is able to dodge or avoid taking real damage. So really just kind of surface level damage, like, puncturing your armor or maybe breaking some chains on your chainmail, things like that, but not mortally wounding you.
Yeah.
And that when you actually take your wound points, that's when you've been severely wounded. And that's kind of how I really do it. I think that once the player has been knocked unconscious from a weapon that's a piercing or stabbing weapon, then obviously they've taken some sort of a mortal wound and they are bleeding out now on the ground. Other people like to, I've seen it where they kind of have like a traffic light. They have like a green, yellow, red, and they know that when their character gets to a certain point of their HP, that they put on this ring on their character, so that they know how to start describing the character a little bit more fatigued or taking damage or showing blood, things like that.
Yeah, and that way of doing it, the way of them, it's like, oh well, they're at full health and whatever, and then like if they take some damage, like oh it damages their armor, or it like it's like a surface level wound or whatever. Like I feel like that's like a way more interesting way of describing damage than just saying you bury your axe in this character's shoulder 7 times, and that's every time they take damage.
Now,
Like
if there is a situation like that, if that's
yeah,
the case, then yeah, go for it.
yeah, but
If you have some big like flesh golem that you just every time you hit this thing, it just keeps coming at you, then yeah, you could sit there and say, okay, this dude broke off his sword inside the golem and it's still coming at him.
Yeah.
yeah,
But most
absolutely.
people get hit with a big piece of steel. I don't think they're going to keep coming after you, but it's
Yeah.
D&D.
It keeps that
or whatever.
Yeah, it depends on how you want to play. Like a lot of us, we like that whole RP, so we like a little bit of realism into it. And one of like the cool things we've started doing at our table is the whole how do you want to do this? So if you're the overlord, your player gets a crazy hit off, deals good damage. You get the damage results. You're looking at the wounds of that creature. It's at 0 instead of saying, yeah, you killed it, moving on. Give them that. How do you want to do this? Especially when it is a big boss villain. This is what everybody's been fighting. They've been pounding away. You have like 2 people who are close to death or already unconscious. And now you hit that strike. To hear that, how do you want to do this is almost like getting a nat 20 at the table.
Yeah, and I think that's become more popular, obviously, because of Matt Mercer and Critical Role.
Yes,
with saying, how do you want to do this? Like he kind of has the catchphrase of it down. But I remember playing games, in Frank's loft where, somebody was fighting some big monster, and instead of him going with the description, he would say, "You tell me what happens. You did this," and it's letting the player, it's engaging with the player to let them kind of control a little bit of the battle.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's another point that we kind of wanted to make, and we were talking about before, where you have like a mass battle, where if you have a lot of underlings or a lot of combatants, where you can kind of let your player or your player characters maybe cut through several of them,
get
without
a little
having
zealous with their description, you know what I mean?
right. And like you don't have to sit there and be like, okay, I have to run through all the stats and run through all the initiatives of all the little squishy goblins that are running out ahead of my orc horde.
Yeah.
You don't really need to do that. You can just let your players kind of go through them. If they hit them, boom, they take them out. Like, so it's more of like an action sequence, and you can kind of describe it in a way that your players get the idea that their characters are above the normal soldier, the normal foot soldier, that they may be a little bit more heroic.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a good thing. And I want to say that Matt Colville is the guy that I saw that from. And I think he did it during the Chain, which is his live stream. And I was impressed by that, by watching these characters kind of enter a battlefield and, like an action movie, just like take out the underlings real quick, and then get down to business with the big baddie. And that was more entertaining, I think, for everybody at the table, and certainly for watching, because you just see the heroes roll up, and it's like the Avengers, the first Avengers movie.
Yes. Yeah.
How many of the little aliens did they beat up before they were like, okay, now we're gonna go fight the big ones?
Yeah.
And
I mean, to be fair, how entertaining that is on a personal note, Cody, because that's how it was for 3.5, and the one time I ran a campaign for you,
my goodness,
where you would just because Greater Cleave in 3.5 was broken because of the way it was described.
It was amazing.
It was amazing.
And so you would just cleave through hundreds of gnolls in a single round, and then
I was like a 14th level paladin, and I had crazy strength. I had a crazy flaming, like, great sword.
Yeah.
And Robert, Neil's brother Robert, was my companion. He was a bard, and he stacked every bonus he could on me, like Cat's Grace, Bull Strength, Mage Armor, everything. And I was basically just a meat grinder for Knowles,
Yep.
and they just kept running in, and I had all the cleaves, I had the power attacks,
Yep.
and I could just keep going.
Yeah, pretty much as long as you drop somebody, you were moving on.
Every turn, I was dropping 3, 4 enemies, and it just got to the point where Steve just kept sending wave and wave, and it was kind of like a 300 setting, like
Yeah, it was
the Hell Pass,
Yeah.
Thermopylae.
Yeah, the Battle of Thermopylae.
Yeah, and where basically it was the two of us fighting this war band of gnolls that was going to come down into the valley and just completely nuke this little village. And we were like two Viking warriors on our way through, and we decided, yep, we're going to hold this road.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
But
a
it was
reason
really memorable
yeah.
battle. It was
Yeah.
it was very fun.
Yeah, there's a reason I don't DM anymore.
But yeah, so we kind of, that first point, describing damage, it can elevate that game very easily, and it doesn't add any more work to the overlord, to the players. It keeps everybody at the table on what's happening.
Mhm.
I think probably an easy way for the overlord to do it, and it's easier said than done because I've missed it myself. But you can we said about the traffic light thing where okay, the characters I honestly I think the Lord of the Rings, the D6 Lord of the Rings had a similar situation where it was like you were hail, or then you were slightly winded, and you could basically move down several categories throughout the day, and whatever those categories were depended on how it affected your bonuses, and so I think you could do the same thing with that description, but also for the monster or for the enemy. And I think that's a good way for you to keep your players maybe in it, because sometimes if they just keep throwing damage at the monster or the enemy and you are not giving any sort of description back to them, or you're not engaging with them, they can feel like maybe they're not doing anything, or they're not affecting what's going on.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to maybe, it's a good practice. And like I said, I used to do it and sometimes I forget to, but take your HP for the monster and split it into thirds or fourth or whatever, and have that as a reminder for when, hey, this creature hits this level, this is what's happening. There's blood coming out of its nose, or its coat is wet with sweat, whatever.
There's actually, I just thought of it now. There's a game that I heard, there's a podcast that I used to listen to.
Called... There's only one podcast.
Okay.
One.
All right.
And it's this one. That's right. This podcast was made in secret.
All the other podcasts are about to get gifted rings.
Yes. Yes.
All the other podcasts are about to fall under
friendship. Don't worry about it. Just put them on.
But anyway, there was a podcast that I used to listen to called Friends at the Table, and they were just an actual play podcast. And there was a game that they played at one point, and they switched to a different system at some point. But the way that the game worked is that actually, like, it's very similar to what we're talking about. Instead of dealing damage, you would give descriptors to different characters. I can't remember the name of the game, but it was like, like you would attack a person, you would say like they are like they are injured, or they are blinded, or they are winded, or they are some, and it was like you had to spend a number of points or something in order to deal them those things, but then you had to take a descriptor yourself or something. Like, it was, I don't really know exactly how the system worked, but it was really cool. And it was actually a lot of what we're sort of talking about at this point, of like describing damage that you deal to characters, is like, that is the whole point of that system.
Yeah, so Lord of the Rings, actually, one of their other systems has that factor. If you deal this much damage, it's a light wound. If you deal this much damage, it's a medium wound. And that's how you're actually supposed to talk about it, because it goes into our second point, which is you trying to stay away from the use of numbers to discern damage.
Yeah.
So granted, yes, tabletop games are a number game. You have to do math. You have to keep track of your total hit points minus after each attack, but there is that whole way, like we've been explaining this like little bit before, that you can explain battle fatigue in a way that's not, oh, I only have 10 hit points left. Oh, I'm halfway down. They used to call it in like what 3.5, it was bloodied. Are you bloodied? Did this happen? When you take a big hit, this is how way you should explain it, not, that's a quarter of my or 2/4 of my health gone,
If
The
my health
cords are
were
tightening.
if my health was measured in a number of say 78, I would
yeah.
be maybe down to like 14.
This is what I deal with, folks, at home.
Yeah,
As a dungeon master, this is what I deal with. Like, if you had to put a number on the monster, where would you say it's at?
The number is.
Yeah. No, that's not.
Yeah. But and yeah, we always do that as joking, but it's a great way to explain, like as Cody was saying, is using battle fatigue. If you don't like to explain the hits that people are taking as mortal wounds, using battle fatigue, their shield is splintering, their arm just can't seem to pick it up anymore, they're tired. Instead of having their regular pose at the beginning of battle, they're now kind of disheveled, they're not holding their sword all the way up all the time, it's always down. These are all great ways to explain that some creature, monster, thing is wounded or tired or been in battle for a decent amount of time.
And honestly, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of like UFC fights, MMA, and everything. If you watch one of those like championship rounds, which is maybe only 20 or I think it's 5-minute rounds, so 25 minutes. In a span of 25 minutes, some of these people, guys and girls, are just pushing themselves to their absolute brink. And you can just see as it goes on. Very beginning, they're bouncing around, their guards up, they're ready to go. They're swinging a million punches every 5 seconds. By the time they hit the 5th round, their guard's down. They're standing back. They're breathing with their mouth open. Yep. So there's things like that you can just kind of look at and add into your game, into your quick description, that can make things a little bit more, I guess, realistic, a little bit more enjoyable.
More in depth is kind of the way I see it. It's not even realistic or enjoyable. It's just in depth. It keeps, instead of having your players at the table, smartphones are an amazing thing as a ability for you and your character sheet. But then the next thing is, it's not this person's turn. They're messaging somebody. They're not paying attention to what's happening. This is a great way to keep that engagement, because it's not just somebody rolling the dice. Here's my result. No, it hit, didn't hit. Yes, it did hit. Roll me your damage. Right. It's now a descriptor, and descriptors are what hold everybody to keeping in. You know what I mean?
Right. And I think we were talking about before, we were saying that, combat is not a thing for everybody. And I think this is a good point to kind of bring that in. We're trying to say about engaging everybody and keeping everybody involved in the combat. And as a player, and also as a overlord or dungeon master keeper, or whatever you want to call it, we call it overlord. When you're in either of those positions, I find myself anyway, when I'm in either of those positions, if somebody at the table, whether they're in my party or they're my players at the table, is not engaged or is not doing something to move forward the combat, or just seems disinterested, that can really be distracting, and it can kind of be catastrophic to your storytelling, by not having that participant. And I've had situations where people have been on their phone, or they're laughing at memes or sharing videos instead of actually paying attention what's going on. I've also had it where players just were not combatants. They simply were just not combatants, and they don't want to fight the gnolls. They don't, that's not their thing.
Yeah.
So you, as a dungeon master or the overlord, if you find that you have that sort of a situation, or you have that kind of a group, that you need to make your battlefield maybe a little bit more accommodating for what you have, like for a group, there's no reason why a non-combatant couldn't go around and interact with an item or a gear or something that is going to change the battlefield, or maybe give the players the advantage over a monster.
Yeah.
There's no reason why your non-combatant cannot still be useful and a part of the combat
Yeah.
without actually having to be, I get 17 attacks, I do 1,000,000 points of damage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't have to do that. And I
Yeah.
feel like that's kind of a thing with spellcasters too. Even my my wizard that I mentioned before, Graz, she's a transmutation wizard. Yes, she has some evocation magic, but that's not all she has.
Mhm.
So she gets to do a lot of damage. She can do damage, but there's also times when she's on the battlefield that she's not really going to be the combatant. And that's at the point where I've made sure that I took spells where, oh, I can give this person haste.
Yep.
Or I can enlarge this person.
Yeah.
Or I can
Yeah.
I can make it difficult for the enemy to get through here or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, like,
that one time we fought Straub the first time, Chris threw up the spike growth or whatever and like shut the whole battlefield down.
Yes. Yeah, that was that, and that's like a good example of, even as a player, trying to use your battlefield and going into our third point of that, dynamic battlefields. So, not just
dynamic.
Yeah, dynamic.
Dynamic.
But that whole aspect of, maybe you're not just fighting the creatures of this area, you're actually fighting the land itself and what it is capable of.
Yeah.
Could be, we had talked about this prior. You did this to Steve, Cody, of having a big pollen storm come through, or you at home could use a sandstorm, anything that kills vision, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's no I think it's important. I think it's important to not. You don't have to box yourself in.
Mhm.
You don't have to just. This is the battle map I made. This is it. This is all the space there is. That's all that can be done. I think you guys would benefit. Everybody would benefit from allowing a little bit of wiggle room around that, and allowing that, that situation with Steve, I mentioned with the pollen, right?
Yeah.
The orcs were attacking this cabin that they were at. The party knew there was no way they could withstand the amount of enemies that they were being sent towards them.
Mm-hmm.
They engaged them outside of the cabin. They met them. They killed some of them. They realized they're going to keep coming. All the while, this storm is moving in. The party decides, we have to move to the next location. We can't stay here.
Yeah.
So they moved from that battle map and they went into the forest. Well, the storm picks up in the forest. It starts blowing this crazy amount of thick orange pollen out of these pine trees. It's this huge old growth evergreen forest in my world. And it starts blowing all this pollen out to the point where the players can no longer see in front of them. And now I'm having combat take place where players cannot see their friends. They can't see their enemies. They're running into each other. A chase sequence occurs. It gets finally to a point where there's a chasm, there's a bridge. The players get to the side. They start breaking the bridge to prevent the orcs from getting past them. It was a memorable moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it was something that it didn't have to just remain at the cabin, remain in that square box, and you have to sit here and roll dice and hit each other with imaginary weapons until it's over.
Yeah.
You don't have to do that.
Yep.
You can do so much more.
Yeah.
And I see people, we talked about it with the monsters in the last podcast about making monsters and creatures. If you throw something that's too powerful against your players and you don't want to have a TPK because, oh, you messed up and you made this monster too powerful, wiggle room your imagination and change up your battlefield. Make something happen. Make the forest floor start caving in. An earthquake happens or a landslide moves in.
Mm-hmm.
You can have all sorts of things happen that just changes the field of battle. It's like watching Empire Strikes Back when Luke and Vader are fighting all the way out to the outside of Cloud City.
Yeah.
And the battle just keeps going. Like, through that whole the whole scenario
Yeah.
changes,
Yeah.
and it makes it more dynamic. It makes it more interesting.
Yeah.
And I think I think that needs to be added on to that point before I said about even for non-combatants, that there needs to be something on the battle map in the world you're presenting that non-combatants can do as well.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there could also be elements, not even just like landslides or fires or things. There could just be other elements that aren't the monster that you're fighting, the thing you're
Bears.
fighting, that are part of the fight that people could interact with, that could, help make it, help change the way that combat goes. One of the more recent things that I can think of is one of the first times that I was playing in the current campaign. We had to go up against this goddess that was getting power from a sacrifice. There was a big pyre with a bunch of people being sacrificed on it. And my character, first thing at the very start of
Cultists
combat,
don't do things like that. Not in my world. That's
no, not at
no,
all.
No.
But the first thing that I did was I created a sleet storm or an ice storm to kill the fires, because that's one of the effects of it, which stopped all the sacrifices from being killed. And if I hadn't done that, if that hadn't been a factor in the fight, then I would imagine that fight would have gone a lot worse. There would have been a lot bigger stuff that would have happened. But because I stopped the sacrifices, that God didn't get that power, and because of that, that helped the party a lot. And there's stuff like that you can include in your combat. There can be like stuff around the battlefield that empowers the monster, that combatants can go, that people can be distracting the dragon while you're going around attacking these crystals that are giving it strength or whatever. And like there's stuff like that you can do in your combat to break things up and make things more interesting than just being like, well, everyone just goes and wails on this dragon until it dies. It's like, well, it won't die until all these things are destroyed, so somebody's got to go around destroying them while everybody else is wailing on it.
But you bring up a good point, and you were absolutely right about that. You stopped the sacrifices, which was that was basically the battery.
Yeah, exactly.
For the spell that the goddess was trying to do. These are elder gods that have a lot of their power has left them, so they're trying to feed themselves whatever power they can. So worship, sacrifice, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And you are absolutely correct about this, because the other players, the older players, know from fighting the god Prisina that was going to be resurrected.
Yeah.
They were trying to bring back this dead god.
Yeah.
That they had found the cult, and they had found where they were doing these sacrifices and basically feeding a section of Prisina's heart with this blood.
Right.
And the first thing my guys did when they got in there, and it was an item that they had had forever, and it was an item that I purposely gave them.
But also, like, the item itself was not like in a regular setting. Nobody would be like, "Oh, this is nothing." Like,
right. It was the decanter of endless water.
Yep.
And so the first thing they did was they were like, "Oh, all this blood is going through all this like grooves of the stone, like towards this heart. Let's blast the blood out of the channels." And that stopped the heart from being fed, and that weakened it. It weakened it quite a bit, and they stopped that process from happening. And they ended up fighting. Neil's gonna hate me for this. They didn't fight the full god. They fought the patron ascendant.
It's all lies.
He just wants to say he's a god killer. But...
I am a god killer.
Yeah, patron.
But yeah, no, like it's but those are all very dynamic battles.
Yeah.
They have more than just, hey, smack this creature. Nope, this creature now smacks you. Oh, it's your guys' turn, you smack it. No, there's so many other things that are going on that even if you have a party that's mixed of non-combatant roleplay type characters and very heavy combatant played characters, now you have something for each one of them to do, which keeps everybody involved. It keeps everybody's attention on the table.
The opposite point of that is don't take it so far.
Correct.
Don't go to the point where the only way to kill this monster is to access its crystal, the crystal palace of its soul, which is buried 500 feet underground underneath the monster. My players will never know about it.
Yeah.
Then how is that going to work out?
Yeah, it doesn't need to be as difficult.
You know what I mean? There was something for everybody to do. Well, yeah, you had to get to the Crystal Palace of the Soul. That's how it had to happen.
Yeah. It doesn't need to be...
you're making it so difficult.
Yeah.
You know?
It doesn't need to be a extreme puzzle from Legend of Zelda. It just needs to
doesn't need to be a 7th grade riddle, because that's even too hard.
Exactly. It literally could just be as simple as these lights are shining down on certain points of the monster. I wonder why. Oh, that's how I heard it. Grand.
Yeah.
It could be spelled out for them like alphabet soup. That's fine. They had tea the night before, and their tea leaves were like, attack the monster here. Grand. Keeps it interesting.
I just think that, you know, you could have... I think some of that problem, honestly, comes from... We say this a lot, but it's a session 0 thing.
Yeah.
It's a session 0 thing, because I sat down with you guys, except for Steve, because I was like, Steve is just going to take whatever I give him as far as role playing.
It's just a benefit that Steve was allowed to be able. No,
exactly. It was like, Steve, you know, we're doing you a favor here. But I did sit down with the other guys, and I said, listen, my world takes place, it's one continent. They have not found any other land. Every adventure that's ever gone out for exploration has failed.
Or at least not returned.
Or not returned. This continent is at war. It's been in a civil war for the last 100 years. And they have basically wiped out most of each other's magic users. They've wiped out most of their generations of fighting folk.
Yep.
And the war just somewhat continues to go on. And my players have been figuring out why this war continues to go on. But there's such a big part of it. I'd explained to them when they first came to play, war is part of this game.
Yes.
Part of this setting. Combat is part of this setting. The Eldritch gods, which are kind of pulling the strings behind my game, are going to fight for what they want.
Yeah.
You are going to have to fight them.
Yeah.
And I make it apparent. I tell my guys all the time. I told you.
Oh, 100%.
If you continue, this is going to lead towards something. You know, this is going to end in a combat, or this person is unreasonable. But you want to make that known, because you don't want to have... I don't want to pull people in to come play this game and have them make characters that never want to pick up a sword, never want to see combat ever. And what I have planned for the next year and a half is a full-scale siege.
Yeah, with squishies,
of a castle,
with lieutenants,
burning oil, battering rams.
Right.
If they don't want that, then don't do it. You know, maybe that's not the game for them. I'm not telling you don't.
That's not the session for these players. Find different players.
Right.
You know.
But now, if something like this is unavoidable in your game, like, there's gonna be a siege.
Yeah. And
you're going to have players that are going to be on both sides of that table of, hey, I can't wait for this siege. I can't wait to fight the enemy. And then also people that are like, I really don't want to do this. They can be doing other things.
Correct.
There's so much more that they could be doing.
Yes.
And I would just urge everybody not to limit your combat to just dice, damage, roll again.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Don't limit it to that, and don't, do the, oh no, this is the only way to do it. Let your players try and do other ways. We've said this for other things. Let them try. Don't just be like, hey, I want to do this. No, I can't. Well, I want to try this. I don't want to stab this person. No, you have to stab them. And, where does that benefit? Where does it not? But yeah, like, you're working in these ways, have those dynamic means. If you have a full-scale siege going on, but you don't want to have 100 things in an initiative order, do a wave system. There's multiple aspects to that battle that you're not going to be able to control or bark commands to every NPC if you're like the commanding officer of this platoon. They're going to have to fight on their own. One of the other games kind of that I played does it really well. It's called Banner Saga. It's a PC game. It's an actual video game, but they do the aspects because it's a strategy game. They do the aspects. Hey, you have 1,000 troops. How do you want to attack this other 1,000 troops? Do you want to charge in? Do you want to be defensive? Blah, 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 blah. And then when it goes into combat, you're still only controlling, you're fighting what your party would have to fight to succeed in the combat. So that's how that wave system works. Yes, there's 1,000 troops here and 1,000 troops here, and we're going ahead, but your characters aren't going to be involved in killing every troop of the 1,000. They're going to have to fight whatever's in front of them in their line, which, you know, if you're fighting a bunch of goblins instead of fighting 20 goblins to kill, and that's your aspect of this wave, you're doing five goblins each wave. So now it spans it out, and it gives that feeling of getting tired. My resources are getting used. My stamina is getting down. I can't recoup after this, and they just keep coming, you know?
And that's another setting point as well. Like Steve, and we said about Thermopylae, where he had my paladin and Robert's bard, and we held this pass because if it hadn't been such a narrow bottleneck, we would have been overrun.
Yep.
Because there's just too many numbers, you know.
Yeah.
Two cannot stand against that many all alone. So you could do the same thing, even if you want to send a big wave of enemies, or you want to move your players to the next section. Don't be afraid to let them say, hey, you know what, DM or Overlord, I think there's too many goblins coming. I want to try to find a hallway, or I want to try to find a room where I can put my back against the wall or something, or I could stand back to back with my compatriots and fight these things off, and we can take turns. There's a lot more that can be done, and I think that's just, I want to keep hitting that point. Just don't limit yourself to just the square. It can go beyond that.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah, 100%, and that's what really changed the dynamics of battle. Another really good point that we want to bring up and kind of give a shout out to these people is know what your monster is doing. So as an overlord, what is the tactics of your monsters? What is, how do they go about? If they drop somebody unconscious, do they automatically, no matter what, give it a double tap per se? Are they gonna make sure to kill something even if it drops unconscious? If you're fighting something that's a very aggressive or malicious type creature, and maybe you let it go one time. Yep, they dropped this person unconscious. They're continuing through. Somebody brought that character back up. I think I did this to you, Steve, in our live play for Extra Life, where you were fighting a bunch of berserker hobgoblins, and they dropped your character once. They were moving on, but then somebody brought your character back up. You dealt a good damage to another one of those hobgoblins. I think you might have killed one of the other hobgoblins. And the one hobgoblin turned around and was like, all right, knocked you unconscious, and then chopped off your head. And was like, that's it. I'm done with this person. This is how it's going to be.
Yes, because they were fighting an intelligent enemy that recognized I cannot leave even a wounded enemy behind me.
Yep.
That's another problem.
Yeah.
So I'm going to dispatch my foe.
Yep.
In the same way that probably the party would have dispatched the hobgoblin.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is something that you can do to certainly set the tone for your combat.
Maybe do it to an NPC first.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
have it done to an NPC, or
nice to not have that happen. But
they come running in. The hobgoblins come running into the village, and you just witness them cut a bunch of people down, and you know that they're not here to just raid; they're here to kill people, and that's how combat's going to go from that point forward.
Yeah. But the people that do, there's a website out there. It's the monster knows what they are doing.
Yes.
Is the group that does this. We'll make sure their link is below.
I think it's just the monsterknows.com, but yes.
Yeah.
But we'll set it up.
And what they do for those people who may not be as well versed in like fantasy ideas of creatures, they go through and they explain this is the type of intelligence that this creature has. Are they a packed animal? Are they not a pack animal? And all of that really allows you to make a more in-depth game in general, because now you can get the mixtures of these different cultures in here, and B, now if you're fighting those creatures, you as an overlord can go about, all right, this is what I would want it to do because of this is how my combat, but this is what it would actually do because of what it knows. So it stops you also as an overlord, because you can do this too, overlords, of metagaming. And it's not just a player issue, it's also an overlord issue. If not, it could be a bigger issue for you, because
I will not stand for these accusations.
You know what everybody is capable of, but if your enemy doesn't know that this person's a paladin because they haven't done anything paladin oriented, they might not focus on them if they're a bunch of demons. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Do they have a capability of detecting good or evil, or is your paladin even good? Who knows?
Right. Is the creature intelligent enough to make a decision? We made the creature the geodite.
Yes.
And we said that the geodite is sort of like a rust monster in the fact that it senses out metals and it desires to eat these metals. But the geodite is not evil. It's not chaotic. It doesn't have plans. It doesn't strategize. It's not going to set up ambushes. The geodite is going to go for the metal. And if you try to get in its way, it will hurt you to get the metal.
Yep.
Because it doesn't care about you. It just wants the metal.
Correct.
And so when you're going to role play that, it's important to know these things, to know how it's going to act. And that's what that website, the Monster Knows What They're Doing, that's what they do. They get into the really, okay, does this creature have an intelligent brain? Does this creature is it hardy? Is it fast? And they try to tell you the best, the most optimal ways that this creature would behave.
Yeah.
And if you watch animals in nature, it's often said that animals take the path of least resistance.
Yep.
But animals also know their advantages, and they also play to those advantages.
Yeah.
One of the things that keeps like the leopard safe on the savannah is that it can pull its kill up into a tree. Exactly. It doesn't have to stay down on the ground and fight with the lions and the hyenas. It's able to escape up the tree. So it's using its ability.
Yep.
Yeah, it's using its ability to survive. And that's what you have to imagine, that even though it's a fantasy setting, that these monsters you're running into are going to behave like that. Now, if you're going to play a game like Call of Cthulhu, well, that is a different story, because the monsters are eldritch abominations from the nether of the beginning of worlds, and
they just do whatever they want.
Yeah.
There's no rhyme or reason.
Even if they want something from you, they're probably just going to drive you insane and then devour you before you know.
Yeah,
exactly. So you should just be comforted with that thought.
Yeah. Pretty much. And
there is no glory in the void.
To our last point before we start wrapping up, and we've
Neil's
hit
saying I'm cut for time.
Yeah, we're cutting for time. But to that last point, and we've kind of hit it all the way through, so it'll be a really quick point, and then we'll get some wrap up. It's the actions in combat. Not every action in combat needs to be an attack action or an action to cast a spell. It could be, I need to perceive something. I need to look at, my character needs to see if this is what's happening because they might do this. Keep in mind, I'm not saying, every skill action is going to take a full turn of theirs, But keep in mind that 6 seconds. Could they look at something, try and perceive it, and then still be able to do something or tell their fellow comrades? You know, there's all of those aspects.
History is full of stories of soldiers on one side saying that they ran into soldiers on the other side and they ended up becoming friends or they ended up helping one another.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens if you're in a situation where there's a big melee, there's a big battle, and you find yourself alone with one of these enemies, one of these supposed enemies? Do you attack them every turn that you have just mindlessly, or do you stop and say to your overlord, I would like to make an insight check to see if I can determine this person's intentions, to see if I think this person is good or if this person is faking the injury that they say that they have.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, you can, it doesn't have to just be, you know, let's just whack each other with swords until somebody's dead.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
there's
I mean,
a lot more that can be done. And
yeah, and even if you are in combat with that creature or that enemy or whatever, it's like if you can figure out that creature might have some intelligence and might not want to really fight, or that, like, if you're at a disadvantage and you have maybe some way to bargain with that creature, or some kind of like way to trick them into thinking the situation is different, then you can try to do that. Like, that's an action that you can absolutely take during combat.
You fight a red dragon, an ancient red dragon, and it's kicking your party's ass. At some point, somebody in your group says, we surrender, we'll give you all of our stuff, we'll give you our gold, we'll worship you, we'll do whatever. The red dragon might take that offer.
Yeah.
Because it plays up to what that red dragon wants.
Exactly.
And it's the same thing when it comes to you with anything. You want to determine what's the motivation for this creature or this combatant or whatever. What's the purpose of this combat? Why are they fighting?
Yeah.
And
I mean, yeah, on that, like, to go back to my one character, my diplomat character, the one that we got into, like, I was in a combat with me and a barbarian were in a combat, and it was like these two big troll monsters and a drider who is, or not a drider, what are they?
Was it a drider?
Oh, okay. I thought there was a different name for them, but yeah, a drider who was up in the roof of this cave, like taking pot shots at us with a bow and arrow. And I had disguised myself as a guard working with these creatures, and basically the barbarian was just like, well, I'm just going to swing at these things in the dark. And the barbarian was a human and didn't have dark vision, couldn't see anything, and was missing every attack. These troll creatures and the drider were all dark vision. They were all hitting their marks. I think one of them hit me and dealt me like half my hit points in damage. And I was like, there's no way we're getting out of this alive. And so I'm like, okay, well, what's the reason? And like Cody said, it's like, what's the reason that these creatures are here? These creatures are here to defend their master. They're here as guards set up to protect a creature that is further down into this cave from people that might want to come in. I'm dressed up as a guard for these people. I'm going to try to convince them that I'm bringing a prisoner to their master for an interrogation because he requested that he come down. And I, made a deception check. I made some, I did all those things that I needed to do during combat on my turn, and wound up ending the combat with nobody dying and us going to where we needed to go, being led by the creatures that we were fighting to the place that we had to get to. So that's a way that you can get out of combat and make it more dynamic and do something other than fight. You engage with the creature in some way that, feels like it could benefit both of you and work to get both of you what you want, versus I'm just going to strike and the barbarian that we were fighting with was like annoyed because he's like, no, I just want to kill everything. I just need to kill everything. We're in combat. We have to kill stuff. And I'm like, we don't have to kill everything. That's not what my character, like, my character is going to just start killing everything.
It wasn't.
My character's going to try to talk to everything. Yeah, exactly.
Right. But that's the thing, is that you were in a combat situation with a non-combatant character, basically.
Yeah.
And you chose to not have combat during combat.
Yeah.
And I, as the overlord, allowed that because I said, this is what this character's strength is. This is what this character's trying to do.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. It's a two-way thing.
For sure.
Where don't just be in that box in your own thinking that I've designed a monster, I've designed a map. They have to fight the monster on the map. They have to do this.
Yeah.
They don't. They don't. They could do any number of things that
Yeah.
resolve.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
And as a player, that's also a way to think of it. Is like just because you're in a thing called combat doesn't mean that you have to fight. You can do anything.
Yeah.
Like Cody keeps talking about how there's players that play combat oriented characters and players that play non-combat oriented characters. And I think that I play a lot of non-combat oriented characters.
I would agree with that statement.
And like I've played bad non-combat characters. In the version of this campaign setting that we're playing in before the one that currently exists, I was a non-combat character because the way that the character's backstory worked was they have magical powers, but they don't want to use them. So it was every combat that I got in, it was like, this character's not going to fight because he can't do anything like martial. And if he wants to do anything useful, it's going to be use the magic that he doesn't want to use. Yeah. And that wound up being terrible. Yeah. But now but then I played as this diplomat, and his whole deal was like, I'm going to talk to everything. And if talking doesn't work, like combat is a last resort. Like if I have to kill something, I will, but it's going to be a last resort for him. And that wound up being really
that's a good way to do it.
But I feel like that's how you, like, even in Symbaroum, right? Mm-hmm. So in Symbaroum, I love the game. My first character I made, basically he's a combatant, right? Yeah. He's a combatant.
Oh, yeah.
But he is, he's not really that bright. He's not really that personable. Mm-hmm. So instead of just having him be quiet and having him just kind of not engage in things outside of combat, I've made it the opposite, where he's annoying. He's boisterous, and he's a buffoon, and he makes an ass out of himself, but he doesn't realize it because he's not bright.
Yeah.
But when you put swords in his hands, he's amazing.
Yeah, he's a force to be trifled with.
Yeah. Right. So that's I get to do both.
Yeah.
And that's my advice even for the players, is you don't have to make. You can have that story-driven, RP-driven character that doesn't give a shit about combat and still be effective in combat.
Yeah.
And it's the same. It's the opposite. You could be awesome in combat and then still be good outside of it. Yeah. You can still have that.
Yeah.
RP.
It's all about striking that balance. It really is. It's just about figuring out how
Session zero, sweet spot, balance.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, as
Bring her
I'm
home, Neil.
sure we could continue going on.
Bring her home.
We've given you a lot of ideas here, a lot of stuff to digest, small steps that you can do to make your combats better, to give better description as a player and as that overlord. It's just a lot of just finding what your table likes. Do they like prose? Do they not like prose? I'm
not going to put up with this.
These are all, aspects. Did I use
too much prose for that bugbear?
Yeah.
Don't describe the spiritual weapon as it hits the enemy, Cody.
What type of spell is that?
I don't want to hear that in my Dungeons and Dragons game.
But to any point, you gotta have some level of description. That's what keeps everybody's back. That's what you think it's really cool because it was perceived or described that way. That's the motivating force in a lot of these games. Mm-hmm. So when you're out there and you're trying to make a really cool combat, it doesn't need to be this awesome monster. It could be this awesome land that you're fighting in, or hey, you remember that one time there was only the two of us and we fought a whole Knoll warband? We're never going to forget that. Those are the things that is what makes, at least myself, I can speak for, love these games.
Or remember the time I outsmarted a bunch of creatures, and
exactly,
we didn't have to fight them, even though like they were ready to kill us. It's like, no, we figured out a way out of it. And
that's really important. And we've said it, a couple different ways today, but it's that collaboration between the overlord and the players to make sure that whatever you have going on at your table, that everybody is enjoying themselves or enjoying an aspect of what's going on.
Mhm.
And I think that if you incorporate that just into your gaming and your storytelling overall, that you're not going to run into these situations where you're like, oh, well,
Yep.
half the people at my table were bored, or half my group hates combat, because you're going to be providing things that everybody's going to enjoy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, for players too, you should do some legwork.
Yeah.
If you
Oh,
feel
yeah.
like if your guys just standing around not doing something, say to the overlord, say, is there anything I see that can help what's going on? Can I look for this? Can I do that?
Yep.
You can be more than just a grunt swinging a sword.
Oh, 100%.
Yep.
But before we get into another tangent, I think that's going to be it for us over at the Bone Pony Ranch.
Indeed.
Make sure
It's time to bring them in.
Yeah, we gotta bring the bone ponies in, get that saddle
Brush
off,
'em off.
brush them down, let them
Feed
get a
'em
nice,
water.
Yeah, get a nice water,
Yep.
some good food.
I mean, like we
And-
said in an earlier episode, bone ponies love a tight ranch, and we got to keep a tight ranch for these
That's
bone
right.
ponies. So.
That's right.
Yeah.
Combat.
On that note, we're gonna call it here. Let us know what you think down below in the comments, and if you're enjoying us even a little bit, hit that subscribe. Let us know.
Subscribe. Check out our Patreon.
Yeah, if
Yeah.
you're liking us more than just a little bit, hit up the Patreon.
You
sure.
want to see more of this 3-piece tendy?
Yeah,
I do.
I enjoy it.
I do.
Yeah, get a little tangy barbecue sauce dipping in
With
there.
sweet and
Oh,
sour.
oof,
Woo.
oof. Now you're hungry, and I apologize for
Yeah.
making you
Yeah.
hungry.
If you're
Sure.
salivating a little bit, listen to this podcast. You're
Subscribe.
welcome.
But,
All right, bugs.
yeah, that's it from us.
Yep.
Sayonara.
Hey, Steven talked in this one.
That's
I
true.
know,
Yeah.
incredible
That's wild.
for once.